Over the last couple of years, you've probably heard a lot about India being this major bright spot in the global economy. But what if that whole success story was, well, a bit of an illusion? A recent analysis we're digging into makes the case that it was all just a house of cards, ready to come tumbling down. Let's break down how they see it.
The piece we're exploring kicks off with this really dramatic title. It translates to India's Cheap Oil and the First Knock of Decline. So right away, you know this isn't going to be a story about economic triumph. It's a story about an illusion and how that illusion started to crack.
So, the core idea here is that India's impressive growth numbers weren't really coming from organic internal strength. Nope. The author argues they were actually the result of a very specific and very temporary external advantage. So, what exactly was that advantage? Well, the entire argument really boils down to one single thing: oil. And not just any oil, but deeply, deeply discounted Russian oil. The source uses this powerful metaphor, calling it the economic oxygen that let India's engine roar to life.
And I mean, just look at these numbers. They really show you the massive scale of this thing. Before the war in Ukraine, India was importing about 68,000 barrels a day from Russia. By late 2023, that number had exploded to 1.8 million barrels every single day. That is just an unbelievable surge.
And this is where that oxygen metaphor really hits home. The author's point is that this wasn't just some good trade deal. It was like the economy was on life support, artificially pumping up its performance and creating this image of a massive boom.
So how did it work? Well, the setup was actually pretty simple, but boy was it profitable. According to the source, India would buy all this cheap Russian crude, run it through its refineries, and then sell the finished products, we're talking diesel and petrol, right back to Europe for a huge profit. It basically became a massive money-making machine.
But here's the catch. The author claims this whole lucrative game was only possible because it had the quiet go-ahead from the West, especially the United States. And that approval? Well, it was about to get yanked, hard and fast.
And just as quickly as this whole boom got started, it began to fall apart. The moment the U.S. decided to change its tune, according to this source, the entire foundation started to shake.
So what was the first shoe to drop? Well, the U.S. went straight for the source. It slapped heavy sanctions on the big Russian oil companies that were feeding India all that cheap crude. You know, giants like Rosneft and Lukoil. That immediately gummed up the works.
And then came punch number 2, this one aimed right at India's wider economy. The U.S. reportedly jacked up tariffs on Indian exports to an eye-watering 50%. That wasn't just a warning shot. That was a clear message.
And guess what? The pressure campaign absolutely worked. The source says that 5 of India's biggest refineries, staring down the barrel of U.S. penalties, just stopped ordering Russian oil. The tap for all that cheap oxygen was suddenly turned off.
Okay, so this all begs a massive question, right? Why the sudden flip from the United States? The author says the answer has nothing to do with economics. It was all about geopolitics.
For years, all we heard about was this growing, deepening partnership between the U.S. and India. So why suddenly pull the rug out? Well, the source argues it's because the whole reason for that partnership was suddenly proven to be a lie.
According to this analysis, the U.S. and Europe were giving India all of this leeway for one big reason. They wanted to build it up as a counterweight to China. You know, a strong ally in a very complicated part of the world.
But then, a moment of truth arrived. The author points to a brief military clash between India and Pakistan in May that they claimed completely shattered America's faith in India as a serious strategic player.
And the source is brutally honest about it with this quote. The logic they're presenting is this: if India can't even handle a smaller regional rival, then the whole idea of it standing up to a superpower like China is, in their words, a crude joke. The credibility was gone.
So, once that confidence evaporated, all the special treatment India had been getting, it vanished. And the economic engine, now completely starved of its fuel, just started to grind to a halt.
The source gets specific about what was lost. They list things like the diplomatic protection for key projects, that unofficial green light to buy Russian oil, and something the author calls the soft corner the U.S. had for India. All of it, according to this view, just disappeared overnight. And so we're right back where we started. That big wheel of development, which had been spinning so fast and looking so good, just started to slow down. Why? Because, as the author argues, it was never being powered from the inside.
It was running on borrowed energy, that external oxygen, and the supply was officially cut off.
So after all that, what's the big takeaway from this analysis? Well, the author wraps it all up with a series of really stark, pretty cynical lessons about how power and alliances actually work in the real world.
The first big lesson is a warning about being dependent. The argument here is that if you try to become great by riding on someone else's power instead of your own, you're setting yourself up for a big fall, because the second you're no longer useful, it's over.
And they don't stop there. The author then uses another sharp analogy, comparing a country in this position to a rented guard. Sure, you're valued, but only as long as you can do the job you were hired for. The second you show any weakness, you get demoted. And finally, the source delivers its most provocative metaphor to drive the point home. It controversially argues that India became like a dog that, living at its master's feet, starts to think its master's power makes it a lion, only to get a harsh reminder of reality when it can't back up the roar.
In the end, this analysis paints a really tough picture of global politics, one where alliances are all business and friendship is temporary. It really makes you stop and ask a pretty uncomfortable question. In a world full of giants, what's the real cost of being a so-called strategic partner?